Welcome back, everybody. Here we are, 2.4 ecological tolerance. And good news for you, this is a very short one. All right, this is going to be a short little lesson today. We're just going to really talk about what does it actually mean in understanding the idea of tolerance and stressors amongst an organism, and how does that influence their survival and their reproductive rates. So, according to the College Board, simple little objective: describe ecological tolerance. So that's all we're doing today. We're just going to describe ecological tolerance. Again, simple word, simple definition for you to understand. Excuse me. Assumptions. Thing we have to assume. We have to assume that every system or every ecosystem has differences. That's pretty easy to understand. There's a lot of differences between abiotic factors like temperature, humidity, sunlight, salinity, flow rate, if we're talking about an aquatic ecosystem. All of those different things actually matter. Now, what we also have to understand is that organisms are adapted to these conditions. So depending on the organism, there's different levels of adaptations, there's different types. So we talk about even like comparing different organisms within biomes. You talk about cacti or succulent plants having thick, waxy coatings on their leaves to prevent water loss. They're best adapted to it. They don't do well when there's an abundance of water. Now, even within a simple ecosystem, looking at maybe our area here, we're looking at some of our plants do have waxy coatings, like hollies. Holly trees will have a waxier coating. They are a broadleaf, but they're still considered coniferous. It's this weird little thing, but they actually will keep their leaves throughout the winter months. Compare that to like a maple tree, which will drop its broad leaves in the winter months. Now, here is the big overarching and very simplified understanding of ecological tolerance. When optimal conditions permit, when your conditions that you are best adapted for, the right amount of water, the right temperatures, the right amount of sunlight, all of those things, which usually will happen, that's what climate usually refers to. But when you have optimal conditions and you have that happening, you will reproduce. When you don't get those conditions, when they're outside of those optimal conditions, you're going to struggle. Your priority becomes survival. And therefore, you are going to focus on surviving, not just on reproducing. So, when conditions are optimal, organisms that are best adapted are going to reproduce and thrive. When they are non-optimal, organisms are going to struggle and potentially could die off because of it. So here are some visuals to help represent the idea of ecological tolerance. So let's kind of go through and kind of talk about some of the things. We see this chart at the top. And when we look at this chart at the top, let me activate my pen here. When we see this chart at the top, you see this preferred niche. This is where the organism wants to be. Now, this is a textbook graph for ecology. So what it means is that this is what, in a perfect world, what we would see. This is not always the case. But the idea of their niche, it can be narrower, all right? It can be broader depending on the type of species. Certain organisms are better adapted to a greater or a wider diversity of conditions. So what we look at is as we go from the center of this bell curve to the outer portions. Here you have a marginal niche is identified. Marginal niche is just referring to, hey, we can survive here. It's not necessarily the best conditions, but I'm still going to be able to survive and reproduce. Then out here is the unavailable. This is where it does not do well. Now, here's the thing. In the middle here, this preferred niche, that's where it survives. That's where it reproduces the most. If we compare that to just the marginal regions, you see at the top, it says zone of physiological stress. It's causing stress to the organism. That stress is not allowing them to reproduce as much. It's not allowing them to thrive, and therefore they're struggling. They're focusing in more on just survival. Now, why are they focusing on survival? Well, those of you that are in AP psychology, you maybe have learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but if you haven't, I'm going to quickly give you a little lesson on it. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is this pyramid at the bottom. And if you notice, everything, like any pyramid, the base is the most important. And this is something that actually comes into educational psychology as well. We've learned about it as teachers. And the idea that if you, as a student, don't have your physiological needs met, if you are hungry, if you are tired, if you are thirsty, if you are worried about survival more than anything, it's going to take priority in your life. That's just nature. Organisms focus first on survival. Then from survival, you can go on to do other things. So if you look, see, survival is pretty much the first. Then you get into safety. Do you feel safe in that situation? If you've got your food, water, and essentials, then you can go into the relationships and eventually it works its way up. And that's the psychology aspect of it. But that applies very equally to organisms and reproduction. Organisms in the wild need to have those physiological needs met. Remember, we talked about the habitat triangle. All right, in a previous lesson, we talked about the habitat triangle, the idea that food, water, shelter, and territory are all essential for an organism to survive. If you don't get that criteria, you don't thrive. And in this situation, if you don't get your food, water, shelter, well, some organisms can leave. Birds, for example, you don't like the food, water, shelter, you get up and you fly to a new area. Why do you think most birds migrate in the wintertime? Because they eat insects. There's no insects here in the wintertime. So they migrate to the tropical regions where there's insects. And then there's just so much competition, they spread out and they come back here in the springs, in spring and summer, different warmer seasons. Right? Now, when we look at that habitat triangle, when those needs are met, again, birds can move to meet their needs, but some organisms can't. How's a tree going to get up and move? It's not. So it's going to have to struggle through it. And that's why it's hoping that the climactic change or the climactic conditions will return maybe the next year. But it could be a couple years. It could be a couple really adverse years for organisms. Again, here's another look at it. At the top here, you see three different factors: survival being basic level, growth being the next thing, and then reproduction. Reproduction requires an immense amount of energy. And so you need to have all of those criteria met. If you are existing within this optimal range, you're going to be able to survive, grow, and reproduce. If you are living out here, you are struggling, and the only thing you're able to do is survive. If you find this other semi successful habitat or realized niche, well, you're just going to be able to survive and grow. All right. It's not going to be thriving. It requires all that criteria to be met in order for you to thrive. Now, each organism, every organism on the planet has a set of conditions that allows it to thrive, and that is its tolerance. Some organisms do not tolerate change. They're very, very specialized. They need those specialized conditions in order for them to reproduce. Oftentimes, these are species that are going extinct or endangered because their conditions aren't being met, especially when we factor in the human influences to these things. When humans influence an ecosystem, maybe it's pollution in a water system, all right? So maybe it's pollution in a waterway or a water system. That can lead to stressors on amphibians and reptiles and fish. Maybe it's humans putting roadways through and more sunlight's getting into an ecosystem. Now, understory plants, which are used to being shaded out, are getting more sunlight and they're not used to that, so they actually don't do well. All of these things matter to ecological tolerance. And it's something I want you to understand, that ecological tolerance really determines the reproductive rates of an ecosystem. With human influences, especially what we talked about in some of the previous lessons, the idea of anthropogenic influences, climate change or logging or different things like that, disruptions to an ecosystem based on human actions, we're putting organisms in more stressful environments and they're not reproducing as much. And therefore, we're seeing populations start to struggle. Do you understand this? Hopefully. Do you understand the idea that ecological tolerance, that organisms need to have a certain set of abiotic criteria met, and when those criteria are met, that they survive, reproduce, and thrive? Hopefully. And if you feel very, very comfortable knowing that, good job. If you don't, you know what to do. Shoot me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you at the next lesson. We're going to keep talking about biodiversity of ecosystems, keep moving our way through. Unit 2, we are more than halfway, I hope, I think. Not exactly sure on that one, but this is a shorter unit. So I look forward to seeing you with the next one. All right, have a good one.
You like that lesson? I know you did. So why don't you go ahead and smash that like button right now. Go ahead and comment. Tell all your friends about how great that lesson was. And make sure you subscribe, because I'm going to keep bringing you AP environmental content that you're going to want to watch. Or do whatever else those other YouTube channels tell you to do. And with that, Maloney.